Hello friends, in this video you are going to learn the waistcoat or split stitch. It's a nifty crochet stitch that looks like the knit stockinette stitch, and I want to show you how to do it flat, in the round, and how to increase and decrease with it. I've been using it on projects like this version of Link's hat from my favorite video game series, The Legend of Zelda. That's going to be the next tutorial I'm working on, so stay tuned and subscribe if you'd like to see that. Anyway, let's get started learning the waistcoat stitch. So you're going to start out with a foundation chain of 20 stitches, keeping everything fairly loose so that the stitches are easy to work into. Then you're going to chain one more for your turning chain, and then you'll work back across that foundation row with a regular old single crochet stitch. Now the secret to making this stitch work is to make your crochet stitches twice as loose as you normally would. The easy way to do this is to pull your yarn through and give it an extra tug in the direction of your dominant hand. So for me, that's to the right. Without this extra tug, it can be nearly impossible to insert your hook through the center of the stitch on your next row. So go ahead and work the rest of your single crochets as loose as you can until you get to the end of that first row. We're going to start by working in the round, so when you get to the end of that row, go ahead and use the tail of your foundation row to connect both sides. And then with your working yarn, slip stitch into the first single crochet space, making sure your circle isn't twisted. Now, normally you would be inserting your hook beneath this V on top of the stitch to work a single crochet, but the waistcoat stitch, or the split stitch, is just a little bit different. Your hook is going to go right through the center front of the next single crochet, and it is a little bit tricky to do this on your first round. Once you do get your hook through the center of that stitch, you're just going to treat it like a regular old single crochet. Pull your working yarn through the stitch, and don't forget to give it an extra tug so that you can keep a comfortable tension. And then yarn over and pull your working yarn through both of the loops on the hook. You can tell that the first split stitch already looks more like a V than the first row of single crochets. If your stitches are just a little bit too tight to work into, you can always grab a smaller hook or knitting needle and use that to pry open the stitch so that it's loose enough to work into. But if you're having to do that for every single stitch, you're definitely working with too much tension. Just remember that that first round of split stitches is always the most difficult to work, so don't lose patience and just keep at it. I promise it will start to get easier by the next round. When I was beginning to learn this stitch, my tendency was to work on either side of the stitch and not straight into the center. Using a big chunky yarn and hook is going to help you get a feel for doing the waistcoat stitch, but once you're comfortable with it, you can really use any hook size and yarn weight that you like. Even though you're working with a looser tension than normal, the stitches will start to even out and lay flat, despite that additional pull on every stitch. Now, when I'm working in the round, I prefer to just crochet in a spiral to avoid having a seam up one side where I work the slip stitch and then chain one to start my next row. If you're doing a project where you need to know where each round starts, you can just use a stitch marker to keep track of your first stitch. If you want to increase, that's really easy. You just work 2 stitches into 1 stitch, exactly like you would a single crochet increase, but still working into the center of the stitch. Decreasing is a little bit more involved, but this is what works best for me. You're going to insert your hook into the center of the stitch from front to back, like normal, but then you're going to weave your hook back through the space in between that stitch and the next one, and put your hook through the center of the next stitch from front to back. This always makes me think of the way dolphins leap in and out of the ocean. After all of that, you just grab your working yarn and pull it all the way through both of those stitches, yarn over, and pull through the 2 loops on the hook. This method is going to give you a really nice, tight decrease that is not totally invisible, but still lays flat without big gaps or holes. Now, if you want to work this as a flat stitch, you can definitely do that, but the result will look just a little bit different, which is why you usually only see this stitch done in the round. The trick to doing this is to always work 1 regular single crochet at the beginning and end of your rows. You'll also notice that the V's of each stitch are upside down when you turn your work to go back across your first row, but it's still going to create a nice tight fabric that doesn't curl up the way knitting tends to do. I love that you can use the stitch in place of a regular single crochet, which is what I did for this dice bag that looks like it's cable knit but is, in fact, entirely crocheted. My last tip is to keep in mind that the single crochet and split single crochet stitches eat up way more yarn than any other stitch, so if you're planning a big project, bear that in mind when you're buying yarn. Anyway, let me know if there's a stitch you'd like me to cover on this channel, and if you found this helpful and want to keep hanging out, it would be so cool of you to subscribe. There are over 500 of you guys hanging out with me now, and it makes me so happy to hear about the projects you're working on, so thank you so much for sticking around. I hope you have a lovely day, and I will see you next time.